Hello and welcome to a highly requested video. It's time for another tier list, this time for the standard metagame of March of the Machine in best of 3, of course. I'm going to be rating basically all the decks that you can find in the metagame that are pretty good. I'm not going to be rating the trash tier decks because that's going to be a long list of brews. So we're just going to tackle the decks that I've played at least and others that I haven't played but that are very good. So there are going to be a few brews in here that I've built myself, and I will be placing those on the tier list. Alright, first up we have Mono Red, a deck that is actually pretty dang good in this metagame, and that's because we have the resurgence of control decks that are finally viable in the metagame, and a lot of more greedy decks like ramp decks and stuff like that, which Mono Red can attack very effectively. It gained a new card in the Invasion, and the Invasion is quite effective at creating like a good flying blocker when you need it, or just overall just a fantastic flying attacker to close off the game with the synergy of cards like Shivan Devastator and other dragons you can also play if you choose to do so. The standard list is still running Raiju, but I think there are many versions of Mono Red that are viable, including those with more dragons, which is the one I'm running, and decks that are more aggressive with like, more Raiju, less removal overall. All of those builds of Mono Red are viable and are good at attacking various matchups depending on your build, but the tools are there. The only thing that Mono Red is going to struggle with is dealing with specifically cards that are in the black color, unfortunately, and that is definitely one of the best colors in this metagame. You're going to have to deal with a lot of very premium removal, like Cut Down and Go for the Throat. You're going to have to deal with Trespasser. Some people are running Flesh Gorger. You also have Shield Red. So a lot of really pesky things that you have to deal with as Mono Red that you don't want to be facing down. White also has decent cards to deal with Mono Red. Specifically, Wedding Announcement is still in the metagame. You also have Wandering Emperor that gains life. You have some people in their control decks running the life gain 3 mana instant spell that gains a ton of life. And there's a lot of hate cards in white as well for Mono Red. So while Mono Red is quite good, it is very specifically effective right now, but I think unfortunately there is enough counterplay in the metagame that in the end, Mono Red will always be stuck at A tier at most, but might even go down to B tier if people are really ready for it, and they can and have the tools to do so if they choose to build their deck in that direction. But as it stands right now, I would definitely place Mono Red in A tier. Moving along to Mono White, we have a deck that has been here for a while in Standard, and now in March of the Machine, it has definitely fallen off. As I mentioned before, control decks are back, and with that, Mono White loses a lot of value since they have to deal with counter magic, instant speed card draw. They have to deal with sweepers that are extremely effective against their own color. So other white sweepers like Sunfall are very effective, and Farewell extremely effective against the enchantments. Their removal spell is limited to cards like Ossification when it comes to dealing with Planeswalkers, which control decks usually have an answer to, so they can get their permanents back. All in all, very troublesome for Mono White to interact effectively with control and ramp decks as well. They have almost no counterplay to ramp decks since they don't have blue themselves or black. It's essentially just a little bit too linear and really not able to compete with the greedier lists out there. As such, I will be placing Mono White in C tier because it simply has too many bad matchups, and I really think it is one of the worst decks that you could pick in this metagame when it comes to monocolored decks. Next up, in the last monocolored deck on this list, it's going to be Mono Black. Mono Black is a deck that is very effective at dealing with aggro decks, and is also effective at dealing with decks that don't have white, like Damir, Rakdos, and stuff like that. So because they still have a threat range that is quite wide, so they have a lot of creatures that are annoying to remove. They still have Shield Red, obviously, and they have extremely good removal spells. The sweepers are actually relatively effective as well. And Go for the Throat doesn't answer a few of their threats. I guess mostly Flesh Gorger. I don't know if there's another artifact that people are running, but there's a lot of variety in threats that you can choose to go for. A card like Cruelty of Gix is still very effective against reanimation decks. You also have access to Gix's Command that is pretty good at sweeping and removing. So overall, the value is still there. The problem is it is quite clunky. It lost a lot of its card advantage in Bankbuster and Invoke Despair. It lost most of its Planeswalker interaction as well, incidentally. It is quite ineffective at dealing with very greedy control decks, I think, in my opinion, just because of those two losses. So I'm going to say, also it's very difficult to beat enchantments as mono black. I forgot to mention that. So any permanent that is an enchantment now has like really, really high value since Invoke is gone. As such, I will be placing mono black probably at the bottom of B tier. But for now, I'll be placing it in B tier. Moving on to Rakdos, the first two-color deck that we're going to be covering. Rakdos, a deck that has basically lost absolutely everything, but it still has a very solid game plan, and that game plan is going to be Reanimation with Breach, Etali, sometimes Cruelty of Gix as well, and potentially Attract Sense, stuff like that. The archetype is still viable because, as I guessed when I saw the ban list, the fact that Breach was introduced in the metagame means that they still have a very clear game plan that they can follow to be pretty effective with a card like Big Score, and overall just very good value, good sweepers, good removal, good threats. And yeah, it's still pretty solid. It did lose a lot of its power, but you know, it gained so much power and it was such a good deck that losing even a lot of its power, it is still quite viable. I would place Rakdos in A tier. The reason I'm not going to be placing it above mono red is because control decks are still effective against Rakdos. Countering their big score is a 2-for-1. Countering Italian Breach is relatively easy since those cards cost a lot of mana. And, you know, overall, the threat range and the consistency is much lower, and their reach is lower. They don't have Invoke. Overall, the deck has still lost enough power where I'm comfortable placing it in A tier. All right, next up, I'm going to be placing one of my brews, which is Gruul Aggro, a deck Gruul modified aggro. So you can build Gruul in a few different ways, I think, but I think the best by far is certainly the modified version, since it has a lot of synergy right now and it is in a pretty decent spot. Now, the main weakness for this deck is going to be control decks in general. So Sunfall is still very effective against it, but it is very good at dealing with other aggro decks, which is kind of impressive. It does have a good matchup into mono red, in my opinion, as it has creatures that are pretty sizable and difficult to overpower. A lot of 4 toughness creatures are available to you, and your overall stats are just bigger than most aggro decks. So it is still pretty effective at dealing with those decks, and it is still pretty resilient against control. So overall, it's just a pretty decent aggro deck. I would not say it's better than mono red, but it certainly has a lot of things going for it, and is one of the only really good green aggressive decks. As such, I would be placing Gruul in B tier above mono black. All right, next up we have Celestia. Celestia Enchantments. So green and white, two actually really synergistic colors with the enchantment archetype. And there are a few different builds. It depends on what you're facing. Unfortunately, there's no way to like predict what you're going to be facing on ladder, for example. So of course I'm rating this for ladder and on MTGA Arena. So the Calyx version, the more aggressive version with Audacity, is extremely effective at dealing with other aggressive decks, and it is also it is better against control than I think the pure enchantment version, which is going to take a longer direction to kind of extend the game out. But that deck is going to be way more effective against non-white decks. Against a lot of non-white sweeper decks, the actual pure enchantment version is going to be with the 4 mana, I forgot the name of the card, but the 4 mana thing that summons a bunch of spirits. That card is going to be very effective if you build around it against a lot of other black decks and things of the like. So I would say the better version of enchantments overall is probably a Calyx deck overall, since it's a lot more proactive, but both are extremely viable. I will be placing Celestia Enchantments above Rakdos in A tier, but still below mono red because I believe it has too many clear weaknesses, specifically against decks with Sunfall, Temporary Lockdown, and Farewell, and unfortunately there are a lot of those in this metagame. So it will be very effective against non-white decks, but it will have some issues dealing with those exile-based sweepers, as they have little counterplay to that kind of strategy. All right, next up, let's go with blue-white control. Basically a deck that is taking mono white, adding blue to it, and using that blue color to really extend its range of matchups. and it is doing that pretty effectively. I think not having black is still a pretty big downside, specifically against decks like mono red, as they don't really care about counter magic in general, so the blue doesn't really do much for you. So you're adding blue to mostly gain a better matchup against other control decks, but you're making your mana base weaker against aggro decks. So that duality is where it kind of misses the mark, in my opinion. It is still pretty good against aggro as long as you have a lot of tech cards in the sideboard, and as I mentioned before, white has a lot of things that can hate out decks like mono red, so I still think it is a pretty good deck. It will struggle quite a bit against other counter magic decks that are a little bit more proactive. I'm thinking mostly about decks like Soldiers or Damir, and other decks like Esper Legends as well that could have counter spells. So those proactive counterspell based decks don't really care about the blue, and the sorcery speed removal that you have in white is not going to be that effective. Even if you use the tax spell, the tax 2 mana instant, that card doesn't really remove anything either, so you're just delaying the inevitable to buy yourself time. But most decks don't give you that time to even stabilize past that point. So I'm going to be giving blue-white control a pretty good rating. I think it's going to be finding itself at the bottom of A tier. Moving along, we have another variant of mono white. It's going to be Orzov, so adding black instead of blue. And it's a deck that uses Breach the Multiverse to gain a huge advantage against mid-range decks. It will essentially annihilate any non-blue mid-range deck that isn't, basically any deck that isn't running counter magic. It also has access to Duress, which gives it a lot of early game snowballing potential with cards like Wedding Announcement and Wandering Emperor and stuff like that. You can really take over other decks like Damir or Esper Control quickly, but it still relies on Duress coming down early, so that's not a very reliable strategy when it comes to beating out Control. And I think since mid-range has kind of fallen out of favor with aggro decks being present and control being present, because of that, like that duality right there, the control and aggro is more prevalent, I think, than the mid-range. So using Breach the Multiverse has really lost a lot of value, and decks need to be a little bit more resilient against either aggro or control to really be in a good position in the metagame. But I still think the deck is fine, and I would definitely place it in B tier. Now, the reason I'm putting Orzov below Gruul and Mono Black is because it is just worse than Blue White Control, and I think it's also worse in the way that it doesn't attack specific decks as effectively as these two do. Because midrange has lost a lot of its spot in the metagame, I think being more on the aggressive side of things gives you a higher advantage point than whatever Orzov brings to the table. So it's basically going to stay at the bottom of B tier in my opinion. We'll see how it goes. All right, next up, I'm going to be placing Damir. Damir, a deck that I've played the most, I think, in this metagame, and it's a deck that has an incredibly high win rate for me, and the more I play it, the less flaws I see in the deck. At first, you might think that the best way to counteract Damir is to play a go wide strategy, but from my testing, the sweepers are actually very effective at dealing with those strategies. The cards like the -3/-3 on green in white creatures, I think it is. Yeah, I think that's what it was. I forgot what the deluge, like a deluge card, and the Path of Peril that destroys creatures with CMC 2 or lower. Both of those are actually very good at dealing with very wide board states. And then if you leave like one creature on the battlefield, it's not a huge deal because this deck also has a lot of spot removal and pretty good creatures itself. And those sweepers don't interact very well with your creatures. So you get to keep your creatures, your opponent loses a lot of their board, and then you can just go 1-for-1 with them for the rest of the match. So I think that puts Damir in S tier. The fact that it also has counter magic makes it incredibly good against control decks. It has very good planeswalkers, which makes it resilient against control decks. It has Duress, which is effective as a tempo tool early game, so it can also play aggressive. It basically has pretty much everything you would want to be good against just about everything. Its worst matchup is going to be a deck like Celestia or decks with a bunch of wedding announcements. If they manage to resolve a few of those, it can get out of hand very quickly. So it does have counterplay, but it also has a lot of tools to deal with those specific cards. What I mean by that is that it has Duress because most of those cards are going to be non-creature spells as enchantments, like the the wedding announcement. So you have Duress for that. You also have counter magic you can load up on. and you have your sweepers in case things get out of hand. So the tools are there. I think the deck is really good. The 2-color mana base is extremely smooth, and the deck just kind of works. I'm surprised to say I was skeptical at first, but I'm pretty much convinced that this deck is near the top of the meta. Okay, the last 2-color deck on the list is going to be Soldiers, Blue-White Soldiers. So Blue-White Soldiers is a deck that is pretty good in this metagame. And the reason for that is because control decks are on the up and up. And control decks are running Sunfall mostly. So white control deck specifically, I would say. Damir being, I guess Damir is not a control deck, but most control decks that are running Sunfall and very slow sweepers, those decks are actually not good against soldiers because soldiers have kind of transitioned into more of a flash game plan. They have access to cards like Spell Pierce, they have access to Make Disappear, they have access to the 2-mana counter with the kicker that makes a 1/1. So a lot of counter magic accessible to them. Very good flash creatures, very good 1-drops with Skrelv and the 2/1. They also have some resilience that they can bring in with Wedding Announcement and Tokasia's Welcome. And they also have Wandering Emperor, which is an all-in-one removal spell, combat trick, and creature. It just has a lot going for it. I think the only problem for soldiers is that black is still a very good color in this metagame. And if people start playing a lot of Deluges, which I'm already doing in Damir, and I think a few decks are starting to do, I think Deluge is very difficult to deal with. Now, again, the deck has counterplay. They can play Spell Pierce and just go low curve, leave 1 mana up. Deluge comes down, you Spell Pierce, and then you kind of snowball from there. So I still think the deck is actually fantastic. Unfortunately, I have not played much soldiers myself, so this is just mostly theory. So I could be totally wrong, but I'm pretty comfortable placing soldiers at the top of tier 2, so in A tier. All right, there you go. I moved things around there. I put soldiers at the top of A tier. Then we got mono red, then Celestia, and then Rakdos, then blue white, and then we have tier 3, the B tier, and mono white still at the bottom there. All right, 3-color decks. First up, we've got one of my brews, Naya with the chef Rocco. Rocco is a pretty good card. Now, unfortunately, as I've been saying throughout this entire tier list, control is on the up and up. It's on the rise. It's definitely near the top of the metagame. And Rocco is not that good against control. Rocco is very, very effective against aggro decks. But unfortunately, if you hit a control deck, then Rocco becomes a little bit worse, if not completely useless, because you're giving them a lot of card advantage, and they can use that very effectively with sweepers completely annihilating you. So it also doesn't have blue, so it has no counterplay to those sweepers, and it doesn't have black either, so can't use duress. So it's in a weird color combination where you don't have access to interaction for control, and that makes it a lot more troublesome to deal with. Now you do have the tax plan, which can work. The deck is not bad against control, but it's not favored at all. It's pretty much, at most, you will bring it to like a 50-50, which is fine. But it does destroy mono red like really effectively, and I do appreciate that. And I think it struggles against slower mid-rangey decks like the Celestia Enchantment version. I think that can be troublesome. Rakdos going bigger than it can be a problem as well, since this is less of an aggro deck, but you still have the tax plan. The tricky thing about Naya is that it still has the tax plan in its back pocket. So things can get out of hand extremely fast if you hit your Thalion 2 into Peacekeeper, or if you hit like a Gobakon into Peacekeeper. You still have access to a good amount of tempo, and I think that really gives a lot of value to the deck as a whole. So honestly, if I had to rate Naya right now, I would definitely put it at the top of tier 3, so in B tier. All right, next up we have Esper Legends. Esper Legends was a deck that I played a lot of in the previous meta, and it's a deck that was theorized to be one of the best decks in the metagame for March of the Machine after the bans. And I gotta say, I think it is pretty good. The problem I'm having with Esper is that you have to modify the list a little bit, I think, and I have not had enough. I have not played the deck enough to really theory craft the best build. I've not been seeing it a lot on ladder, but I still think it's pretty strong. The issue with Legends is that since we have a lot of black decks all over the place and a lot of control decks, sometimes you can have some trouble with dealing with cards like Sunfall. And I've seen a lot of people trying to counteract that by playing Make Disappear, Wedding Announcement, and a bunch of Planeswalkers, and I think that line of attack is pretty good. Unfortunately, I've not experimented with that myself, so I'm going to go off of pure theory here, and I'm going to say that Esper Legends is probably one of the best decks in the meta. I think people are either sleeping on it for some reason, or are just bored with it, which is also pretty likely, I would say, that people want to experiment with other decks, since Esper Legends could be a little bit boring for some people, I would say. But I still think the deck just has way too much going for it with Skrelv with a perfect mana base, basically. Access to a lot of tools and a lot of directions that you can bring the deck, and very insane threats like Rafine, Shield Red still. We still have access to Urtai, which is a fantastic counterspell and a removal spell. I am having trouble seeing how Esper Legends could not be an S tier. Now the question is, do I think Damir is better than Esper Legends? Because that's how I have it set up right now. And I will say that Damir probably has a better matchup into aggro decks because it's boasting those sweepers. And it plays a more controlling game plan against those aggro decks and also against Celestia. Celestia can be a problem, I think, for Esper Legends since they can go wide extremely quickly. So I do think, again, I think Esper Legends has the tools to be here. I think most people who are playing it are playing a version that is probably in A tier, but I think it has the potential at its peak. If you look at the decks that I'm placing in tier 2, you can just add counter magic. Some sweepers to deal with Celestia like Deluge, I think, would be effective if you manage to build your deck around that, which I think might be possible. Maybe not, actually. I don't know. If Esper Legends has trouble dealing with Celestia and Mono Red, which I think it should be okay against Mono Red, but again, I have not played Legends at all this meta, basically. So this is just theory. I do think it will be very difficult against soldiers, though. Yeah, it might be top of A tier, but I think I would still. I usually like placing 3 decks in S tier, basically, because I think that's usually like the standard. And I think there's too much. There's too much in Legends for it not to be S tier, I think. Even if people have not found the best list for it. Like the card quality is just so high. Like usually that's a recipe for success in standard. So I think it has to be here. I will definitely play it a little bit more, figure that out. But that's where I'm going to be placing it for now. All right, another 3-color deck, and it's Esper Control. Esper Control is very good. Very good. It's very effective against aggro, as it has very good instant speed interaction. It has decent mana with the Triumph. It also has access to Sunfall, so it has extremely good sweepers. Basically, the whole of the color combination has tools to beat just about everything. Again, it's a similar thing with Esper Legends, is I think you have to find the right list. A list that is balanced against aggro, that has like a balance of anti-aggro tools and it has a balance of anti-control tools. Usually you're going to be naturally good against mid-range, so that's not really a problem. That balance, once it's found, I think will clearly put Esper Control in S tier. I think a card, even the signature Esper card that you get access to, the 3-color card, Void Rend, I think is absolutely fantastic in this meta, as it deals with planeswalkers, enchantments, goes through wards, so it deals with Trespasser, it deals with Rafine, and overall it's just very, very effective since other people are also playing blue, can't get countered, so you get to remove basically everything that you possibly could want. So yeah, I don't see how Esper Control would not be at the top. It absolutely annihilates the deck with like decks like Celestia. It destroys any reanimator slash ramp strategy because it has counter magic. It is extremely effective at removing things. It has good threats now with the invasion. It has Mirex. It has Wandering Emperor still. It has good card draw. Pretty much, it just has everything. You have the tools to beat out everything. Now the key is to find the balance of what tools you can kind of cut, what tools you want to bring in. That is the difficulty in building Esper Control in a similar fashion to building Esper Legends in this metagame. Now, is Esper Control better than Legends and Damir? I think it is. I would say it is. Yeah, I think Esper Control is probably the best deck right now, and the reason for that is just the toolbox. Essentially, Damir, while it's very good, you do lack that security against the decks like Selesnya, the more go wide decks that would require something like Sunfall. Having access to that is absolutely fantastic. Now there is something that I'm going to test out very soon. It's going to be basically taking the core of my Damir deck in just adding white for Sunfall and seeing how that works. Because in theory, since Damir has been so good, and its only weakness was that I felt like I needed like a Sunfall or a Farewell at some point, maybe the mana base is good enough where I can justify splashing basically the Sunfall to make Damir even better. But I guess that would just be Damir control. I think it would more be Damir mid range, not Damir. It would be like Esper mid range because I think Damir is more mid range. So it would no longer be Esper control. So I think there's a potential for an Esper mid range that would be above Esper control, and that could be the best deck in the metagame, I would say. And lastly, we have 5-color ramp, the only ramp deck in the metagame, and it is pretty decent. Now it did lose Bankbuster, and it also lost Fable, which was not played in every deck. Now it's more of a standard ramp with the Dino. I think it's the Dino, the 4/4, and then the Invasion. Now people are playing Briefcase, so we've got extra ramp. The deck is quite effective against specific decks. Unfortunately, it's not good in a variety of matchups. The problem with the ramp deck is that first of all, it needs to assemble its own game plan, which can be troublesome. But if it does assemble its own game plan, it will greatly struggle against control decks that can take the game into the distance, have counter magic up for their threats, and they don't really have threats outside of their 7 drops. You know, they have the 4/4s obviously, but those get wrecked by Sunfall as well. So it's kind of difficult. No haste. Sideboard, they have Tyrannix Rex, which is very effective against certain decks, but I think like if you look at Esper Control, Void Rain goes through Ward. You got Sheoldred's Edict that goes through the Dino. Even go for the throat if they have 6 mana, they can be ready to pay it. Like it's totally fine. Unfortunately, I just think the fact that Ramp just loses that hardly, that hard to control, I think that's a massive problem. Like any deck with counter magic is going to be feeling pretty dang good against the ramp deck. Also, keep in mind that even if they do manage to adapt, even if 5-color does manage to adapt, they can be susceptible to cards like Stonebrain, very dangerous card. Cards like Kotose, which if you look at these decks right here, they can all play Kotose. That could be a huge problem. Like they counter your first Haymaker, they go in your graveyard, they grab it, they can cast it themselves, which is not the main thing, but just the fact that you can no longer have access to those really impactful spells, you're left with a bunch of ramp spells, your deck becomes clunky. Essentially, what I'm trying to say is that 5-color ramp is too clunky. It is very effective at dealing with Selesnya and decks that are a little bit on the slower, go wide, mid-rangey strategy. I don't even think it's that good against like other breach decks, so like Orzov and Rakdos. Like they can use your own haymakers against you with breach, and they get there about just as fast. Not Orzov, but Rakdos with big score can get there as fast as you can, and breach digs way deeper into your deck, so it's pretty dangerous. Like they have more reliable ways of finding Atraxa, and they have a tally that can cast your own spells too. It's very dangerous to play against this. Blue Eye Control has counter magic, sweepers, exile base. They got a planeswalkers that are extremely annoying. They have access. Most importantly, I think, is that they have access to disenchant effects, so cards that can destroy enchantments, which are your main source of removal. So once you remove a planeswalker with like a binding, and they can get it back with like a farewell eventually when you play like your 3/3s with domain, that can get out of hand. A deck like Soldiers, as I mentioned, are very effective against Sunfall decks that don't have black specifically, because well, this deck does have black, but I don't actually. It doesn't use any black spells, does it? No. It would. The ramp deck is a deck that will very greatly rely on its sweepers to reset the board, and Soldiers has very clean answers to that with just counter magic that counters like a ton. So very difficult matchup for 5-color. Either way, I still think 5-color is a good deck. It's basically kind of a high roll deck. I think I would put it in A tier at the bottom. Maybe it's better than blue-white. I'm not sure, actually. Maybe it is. I'm trying to think of the meta overall. So would I rather have blue-white against these decks? Probably not. Wait. No, I would not want this. Okay, never mind. Yeah, this is probably worse. I think, yeah, if you look at these, so the 5-color attacks Celestia pretty well, does not do well against this, can do well against blue-white, I guess, probably not. Nah, I probably won't. So we'll lose to this. The only deck it really wins reliably would be like maybe Legends, maybe, definitely Celestia. So maybe Legends, definitely Celestia. Mono red, maybe with enough hate in the sideboard potentially. Yeah, with enough hate in the sideboard, maybe mono red. So you've got like a few good matchups. Definitely destroys Gruul and Naya, I think, easy. Mono black, pretty easy. So the fact that it does beat out the tier 3 decks in the B tier pretty easily, I think, is a huge bonus. I mean, maybe, you know what, maybe mono white is not like that, like, I don't know if it's a tier below all of these, honestly. I'm just trying to like separate each variant of mono white, but I think realistically you'd probably place it here. I just think it's probably, I don't know, it looks better if each version of mono white, like you have Esper. It's funny, you add 3 colors, so you take white, you add 2 colors top, then you remove a color, you remove black, it goes lower tier, you remove blue, you add black, it goes even lower. And then mono white, I think it's more aesthetic this way. You have like the quad mono white. Well, the Esper control deck is very far from mono white, but I think you can build an Esper control deck that looks similar to like mono white mid range. I think that deck might be viable as well. I still have not tested that. I tested just pure Esper control. It would more be Esper mid range at that point as well. I think there's a lot to explore still with Esper, the Esper colors. And yeah, okay, that was a pretty long video. Anyways, I hope you enjoyed this tier list. I don't make them often, and it was quite fun to make. I'm not 100% sure about some of these placements since I haven't played some of these decks myself. It's been a while. I haven't played like Legends since the new meta, but I faced it a lot. I have not played against Soldiers that much. This is pure theory. I think Soldiers most of the time, so I'm pretty unsure about Soldiers. The rest I'm pretty solid on though. I think it's mostly Soldiers. Legends I have not tested again. Rakdos I haven't played that much, but I've played a little bit of it. It still feels like totally fine. It has its matchups where it's very good, I think, still. Blue-white control I've not played that much. 5-color ramp I've played against, I've just destroyed it every time. The rest I played kind of a mono black and best of 3, also unsure. It could be higher, could be lower, honestly. I don't know. I have not played mono black and best of 3, only best of 1. But yeah, either way, hope you enjoyed the vid, and I will see you all in the next one. Bye-bye. If you enjoy my content and would like to help me keep making it, consider supporting me over on Patreon, where you can access to a bunch of bonus videos, as well as other rewards depending on the tiers. And thank you so much to all the lovely patrons that are already subscribed. I appreciate it very much. And I will see you all in the next video.